Hello, hello. The following is my Wildlife Behavior Exam 1 oral portion, and I am Taylor Hancock, so I will go ahead and get into it. So first of all, one of the main things that we have discussed in this unit up until now are Tinbergen's questions, which I apologize if I'm saying that incorrectly. But these 4 questions are extremely important in what we've been learning about. And so knowing the ins and outs of these questions can really be beneficial in understanding the later material. But to start out, question 1 includes a causational question. So this would be something like, how does the body produce the behavior? This is looking for a cause behind the behavior. And so question 2 is more on the developmental side. How did the behavior change over time? What factors influence the behavior? That sort of thing. Question 3 is more of a functional question. And so this is looking at how behaviors allow for reproductive success. How does the behavior allow the animal to be more functional in whatever environment it is in? And then lastly, question 4 refers to a phylogeny. And so this is wondering, how does the evolutionary history of the animal contribute to the behavior in question? So which questions are which? Which ones are more approximate questions and which ones are more ultimate questions? The main thing to remember is that question 1 and question 2 are approximate questions, while question 3 and 4 are more ultimate questions. And this is due to the nature of the questions themselves. And so question 1 and question 2 are how a behavior happens. This is looking at like the immediate changes of the behavior and that sort of thing. And so these questions can usually be answered more quickly and without as much reasoning. However, on the other side of the coin are the ultimate questions. So this is question 3 and question 4, again, like I said, and these are questions about purpose and meaning. These can be harder to answer because the answer may not be very clear cut. And so that kind of differentiates the 2 types of questions out of the 4. So an example of how these questions can be put into practice is hamsters hoarding food. So this is a behavior that occurs throughout a hamster's life. A hamster may decide it needs to hoard food in its cheeks. We've all seen really cute pictures of the hamsters with like really full cheeks. Maybe they're full of nuts or berries or whatever the hamster is in the mood to eat. And it will save this food for later and maybe won't eat it in one sitting. So an example of how these 4 questions can be applied to a behavior like this, starting with question 1, would be, how does a hamster hoard its food? The answer to this question is that it has pouches in its cheeks, which will be used to store food for later. Example question 2 is, how does the hoarding behavior happen? Is this occurring naturally, or is it learned from its community? Most often this occurs naturally. Now for question 3, why does the hamster hoard? This is potentially due to increase its survivability. There may be another reason though, but it's usually due to the hamster wanting to have enough resources for itself to have a meal later. And then lastly, that brings us to question 4. Do similar animals like squirrels or gerbils have the same urge? Yes, they do. Many small animals like rodents oftentimes will hoard food in a very similar manner. So following this, another very important topic that we have been discussing thus far in our class is proximate control of behavior and what an organizational effect can be. Now, an organizational effect is one which a hormone will have a long-lasting effect on the body, and this usually occurs during a very sensitive time for the body, like development, or when the body is growing up, going through changes, but basically when it is vulnerable. And so an example of this is a free Martin offspring in cows. So if a cow is pregnant with twins, and one of those twins is a female and one of those twins is a male, the female will always be born sterile, or almost always be born sterile, due to the exposure of the testosterone that it had while it was in the shared placenta. Because when a cow has twins, they don't have 2 separate sacs, they share one sac. So when the boy starts producing that testosterone in there, it also will have an effect on the female. So when the female is born, it will not be able to reproduce on her own, and she may even exhibit male-like characteristics. And sometimes the female may not even have a developed uterus. So that's an example of what an organizational effect can have. This is a hormone that had a long-lasting effect. And so that brings us to proximal control of behavior. And the other side of proximal control of behavior, which is what is an activational effect. An activational effect is a bit different because it is an effect that a hormone has that is only temporary, and this is due to the level of the hormone secreted and how much of it is circulating throughout the body. An example of this would be that deer are seasonal breeders, and they will only breed when the daylight is short. So when there's less daylight and the days become shorter, the reproductive hormones will trigger, and for a female, for example, this is when she would go into heat. A different example, though, is spraying in male cats. This can be activational because testosterone levels in the cat can cause him to spray, which would be to mark his reproductive territory, especially if he smells another female around or even smells other males around, then he may want to mark his territory by spraying. So that's another example of a hormone that would have a short-term effect on the cat. But the difference between the organizational and the activational effects is that the organizational effect is not short-lived. The activational effect is short-lived and does not cause lasting effects on the body. So they're a bit different in the way that they work, even though they're both hormones. So this leads me to our next topic, which are behavioral studies. There are many different types of behavioral studies, which can be beneficial because if everyone is studying something different, they may need a different method to study whatever the goal is to find out. So the first example is cross-sectional. So in a cross-sectional study, this is a study conducted at a certain time with a specific point. If you think about what a cross-section is, if you were to take a cross-section of, say, a plant or something like that, you would be able to see the individual, whatever is inside of the plant at that time. So it's kind of like taking a picture of whatever it is. This can be very advantageous because it's a good way to get a lot of information in a quick manner. However, there are several disadvantages to cross-sectional studies because there can always be variability in differing groups. So if we're only looking at one group at a time, and we're not comparing it to any other group, this can be dicey because the two groups could be completely different, and then our data and our results might be biased towards that one group, or we'd just be simply lacking information. So it can be not ideal in all circumstances. That's not to say that it's not ideal to use a cross-sectional study, but there are some disadvantages to it. An example of a cross-sectional study is the associations between forest specialist birds and composition and woodland habits in a highly modified landscape. So the objective of this study that I found was to find out if the amount and the configuration of certain trees and their species had a correlation on bird species numbers in the area. So for example, if a really dense wooded area had a lot more birds, then that might be something to consider, especially if a different area of that forest had almost no trees and there were almost no birds. So this particular study was taking place and looking at the differences between one population of birds and where they sort of hung out and spent their time. So that's what made it cross-sectional. However, a behavioral study, which includes a longitudinal study, excuse me, is an individual and how they can change over time, specifically how their performance may change. So this is a bit different than the previous type of study because we're looking at how one individual varies over time. So the advantages of this are that the studies tend to be very thorough. We have a lot of information from start to end, and we can use that information going forward. However, the disadvantages of this is that sometimes results can be repeated. Sometimes we're looking at the same individuals, sometimes the same individuals have repeat behavior and that sort of thing. So it kind of ends up as a bit of repetitive information on occasion. And then an example of this is the older birds having better feathers. This is a study on the long distance migratory sand martin. And the objective of this was to find if there was any type of correlation where older birds had better feathers. And they did find that older birds tend to have better quality feathers, but in order to find this information, they would look at one bird and see how its feathers developed over its lifetime. So this was considered longitudinal. Now, the main difference between the cross-sectional and longitudinal is that the cross-section sample size is usually smaller, while the longitudinal is larger. And the longitudinal can often take longer. But depending on what information you would like to find, like I said earlier, it just kind of depends on what type of behavioral study you would need to conduct. It just depends on what we're looking for and what wants to be found out. So this brings me to my next topic, which is communications. This is another extremely important topic, especially in wildlife biology, because all wildlife communicates at some point. And so to start off, I'd like to talk about cooperative signaling. So cooperative signaling, excuse me, my tongue is getting all sorts of tied here. This is when a signal between two animals is beneficial, and it is beneficial for both parties. An example of this would be if one animal found some food and signaled to other animals what it found. An example of this is actually the prairie dog. So oftentimes prairie dogs, they have very large networks under the ground and they will signal to each other to communicate. Now, a cost of this type of communication, it's hard to say what the cost is because this is a beneficial relationship for both parties. And the benefits, like I mentioned, are it allows multiple animals to work together for a common goal. This is good for both parties. So it is, like its name, very cooperative. Now, dishonest signaling, on the other hand, is when the signaler signals something that is not honest, and this could be amping up its size to appear more threatening or something like that. But whatever signal the signaler is producing, it is not accurate or not true. So the receiver of the signaling ends up being deceived. The cost of this can include, if the bluff is called, the animal may be in trouble. The trust could be broken as well. Say, for instance, like this pufferfish, if he puffs himself up to make himself look big and his bluff is called, he could be in sort of danger because he is not actually that big. But a benefit is that it can allow the animal to better fend for itself because it may appear tougher than it is. Oftentimes, when said pufferfish puffs up, whatever predator or whatever threat he is currently facing will go away because it thinks that it's a bigger size than it actually is. Now, incidental cues are a little bit different. This will occur when the sender of the signal sends a signal, but it doesn't necessarily intend to influence the receiver's actions. And this really confused me the first time that we went through it because I really couldn't wrap my head around what an incidental cue might be, but a good way to describe it is unintentional signaling. The cost of this may be that the signal has the potential to give up valuable information, such as, take these birds for example, if they are flying away, their wing flaps might be heard by other animals. That would be their unintentional signal. And so the information that could be given up in this instance is where the birds are at. Especially when you think of things like duck hunting or something like that. If you were to hear the birds flying away, your attention goes there, and then you know where they are. But a benefit to this is that information is sent unintentionally, so oftentimes it is very true. And if the birds start to fly away, like in this example, then other animals around the birds may know that there is danger in the area and that they too need to leave. And then lastly, we have spiteful signaling. Spiteful signaling might be one of my favorite signals that we learned about just because I kind of find it a little bit funny. But spiteful signaling is when the signaler sends a harmful signal, and this will oftentimes hurt the signaler and the receiver. No one benefits, and no one benefits. An example of this would be if two puppies were playing and one got mad that the other had a ball. and the puppy takes the ball away and hides it. Well, now neither one of them are using the ball, neither one of them are able to play with the ball. So this is definitely done out of spite, and now no party is benefiting. So last thing on the list for this unit is the polar bear foraging on common eater eggs, which hopefully I'm saying that name correctly. But this was the last topic for this PowerPoint. And so this was a study conducted, and to determine if bear foraging on the eggs was beneficial for the bear or not. So the species involved, of course, are the polar bears, the sea ducks, the common eaters, and seals were also mentioned. They weren't necessarily a contender in this study, but they are usually involved in the polar bear's diet, so I just wanted to mention them as well. The study site location is the Medivik Island in Nunavut, Canada. I probably said all of that wrong as well, but it was the East Bay Migratory Bird Sanctuary. That's the location of the study. And like I said, the purpose of the study was to examine individual polar bear foraging habits and determine the costs and benefits of having those eggs in their diet. So the methodology and the math behind this is that researchers were able to set up recording devices on over 400 clutches of birds by the use of drones. And so by the end of the season, the bird nest had depleted almost entirely. Mathematical calculations were needed in order to determine energy gain, energy loss, how many calories the eggs produced when they were eaten, how many calories it took to go for the polar bears in order to find the eggs. So all of those had to be calculated mathematically. And so the findings and conclusions were that as the season went on, the bears spent more time looking at the bird nest. The eggs provided an energy benefit for the bears, so it was worth it for the bears to go and look. But the very sad part of the study is that the bears were depleting the energy sources around them due to their environmental challenges, which is why I included this picture over here to the right. The polar bears don't have as much land due to the melting of their habitat, and so they are forced to look for other options as far as food goes. So they ended up eating more eggs at the beginning of the season, specifically because there were more eggs available at the beginning of the season. But the longer time went on, the less were available, the more energy they had to spend in order to find them. So that is kind of all of the information as far as that goes. And here is my works cited. Thank you very much for listening. Hope you enjoyed.